Blake Lively just hit a major roadblock in her ongoing lawsuit against Wayfair. The judge has ruled that she can only seek discovery documents up until February 18th. Anything beyond that is considered irrelevant and a part of active litigation. Defense. Plus, Blake's request for access to other unrelated complaints was denied, and the court made it clear that her allegations of an ongoing smear campaign are no longer valid. This ruling has really put a cap on her case, leaving her with fewer options. So what happens next for Blake? Will she continue to push for more documents or accept the outcome? Let me know your thoughts. Blake Lively's legal battle with Wayfair has entered a critical phase, with the judge making important decisions that seem to be working against the actress. The recent court ruling has brought to light some pivotal moments in the ongoing discovery process, which could determine the case's future. Discovery disputes in lawsuits are not uncommon, but they can sometimes get overwhelming, especially when both parties are requesting a large volume of documents and data. Blake's legal team filed a motion to compel Wayfair to hand over specific documents related to the allegations in her complaint, and they also sought additional materials dating back to the date the lawsuit was filed. What Blake wanted, in essence, was a treasure trove of documents that would provide insight into the company's operations and any potential wrongdoing connected to her claim. Wayfair, on the other hand, didn't see the necessity of some of Blake's requests. They argued that much of the information Blake had asked for was already going to be provided to her, rendering her motion to compel largely redundant. However, the drama didn't end there. Blake went on to submit a supplemental list of documents that she claimed were essential for her case, spanning almost 9 months after the original filing date. This supplemental list only added more complexity to an already complicated legal situation. Wayfair was particularly resistant to this, saying that they didn't feel comfortable sending over the requested documents and that if Blake wanted the additional information, she would have to extend her discovery window, a proposal that was met with little enthusiasm. This tug-of-war between Blake's legal team and Wayfair showcases the inherent challenges of discovery disputes in high-profile lawsuits. The process is often a battle of patience and legal maneuvering, where each party aims to obtain as much information as possible while defending their own interests. Blake's team, on the other hand, was adamant that they needed every bit of evidence available, claiming that it was crucial to their case. Meanwhile, Wayfair was sticking to the argument that they had already complied with most of her requests. In light of these complications, the judge ultimately weighed in on the matter, granting Wayfair a small victory in terms of limiting the scope of the discovery period. The ruling, which was handed down in response to the omnibus motion to compel, essentially confirmed that Wayfair had already provided much of the information Blake had asked for. The judge emphasized that the scope of the discovery was somewhat premature and noted that much of what Blake had requested was irrelevant to her case. The court gave Wayfair a firm deadline to turn over the documents that were agreed upon, but for the most part, Blake's request to extend the discovery period further than February 18th was denied. This was a significant decision, as it signaled the judge's unwillingness to let the case drag on indefinitely. According to the ruling, anything beyond the date of February 18th would not be relevant to the allegations that Blake initially made in her complaint. The decision placed a limit on how far back the court was willing to go in reviewing the evidence. Anything after that point was seen as disconnected from the case's central claims and thus deemed unnecessary for further investigation. This ruling essentially makes it clear that the judge believes that the ongoing litigation is not, in fact, a smear campaign, as Blake had claimed. The defense by Wayfair and the way they're handling the litigation has nothing to do with attacking her reputation. It's just standard procedure in the midst of an active legal dispute. The court's stance is critical here, as it shapes the way Blake can now approach the rest of the case. In addition to this, another critical aspect of the judge's ruling centered on the documents related to Blake's claims of harassment and discrimination. Blake had also requested access to additional records of complaints filed against Wayfair or any of its employees. However, the judge did not allow Blake to go after any complaints that weren't directly related to the type of claims she was making. For example, Blake had asked for documents related to sexual harassment and discrimination, but she could only get her hands on documents that were specifically tied to allegations involving her own case. The judge clarified that any complaints unrelated to the case could not be disclosed. This decision by the court was likely seen as a win for Wayfair, as it limited the scope of discovery to only what was relevant to the current litigation. The The judge's ruling also addressed whether or not the Wayfair employees involved in the case could be required to hand over their personal communications and files. It turns out that the court sided with Wayfair, declaring that any attorney-client privilege related to their defense would remain protected. In this situation, the judge pointed out that Wayfair's legal counsel could speak freely on behalf of their clients without having to worry about disclosing confidential communications in the public sphere. This is an important distinction, as it shields the defense's strategy from being exposed to the public and potentially jeopardizing their ability to mount an effective defense in court. One of the most significant aspects of this ruling, however, is the clear boundary that the judge set regarding the so-called smear campaign. Blake's allegations that Wayfair was engaging in a coordinated effort to tarnish her reputation were struck down by the court. The judge made it clear that anything Wayfair said or did in response to the case from February 18th onward could not be considered part of any smear campaign. The company was merely defending itself in an ongoing lawsuit, and the judge emphasized that this was a standard legal practice. This ruling drastically limits the scope of Blake's claims. It effectively negates any potential arguments she might have made about Wayfair and its representatives trying to destroy her public image. Any further public commentary made by Wayfair or its employees on the matter would no longer fall under the category of malicious defamation. Instead, it would simply be part of the company's defense in the legal proceedings. This could be seen as a blow to Blake's case, as she had originally framed the entire legal battle in terms of a conspiracy to defame her. With the judge's order in place, the court appears to be drawing a clear line between legitimate legal defense and attempts to damage someone's reputation. Now, looking at this from a broader perspective, it's clear that Blake Lively is facing a tough road ahead. The latest developments in the case highlight the complicated nature of legal battles, where small victories and setbacks can pile up, ultimately determining the final outcome. While there have been some wins for Blake, particularly in the discovery phase, she's also experienced several losses that could jeopardize her ability to succeed in the future stages of the case. The judge's ruling seems to be a decisive moment in this lawsuit, one that draws a firm line about what will and will not be considered relevant in the ongoing litigation. With this decision in place, Blake Lively now faces significant challenges in proving her case against Wayfair, particularly when it comes to the smear campaign claims that form the basis of her complaint. The legal intricacies of this case have escalated, and as we move forward, the complexities continue to unfold. Blake Lively's team has been pushing for extensive discovery, seeking a variety of documents from Wayfair that could help to support their claims of discrimination and harassment. However, the discovery process is never as straightforward as it seems. For every document or piece of information that Blake's legal team requests, there is resistance, especially when it comes to sensitive data that could impact Wayfair's operations or reputation. The heart of Blake's case rests on her belief that Wayfair was intentionally smearing her name, a claim that she argued needed to be supported by documents showing a broader pattern of misconduct within the company. This is why the stakes are so high for both sides. Blake's team needed these documents to prove that Wayfair had a habit of mistreating employees, or that it was targeting her specifically. On the other hand, Wayfair was adamant that these documents should not be disclosed unless they directly tied to the case's original allegations. The decision to limit the scope of discovery, particularly concerning the time period from February 18th onward, has been a significant blow to Blake's strategy. The court ruling that the relevance of the documents diminishes as time passes after. The initial filing of the complaint makes it clear that any further evidence tied to ongoing actions by Wayfair and its employees won't necessarily strengthen her claims. Instead, the judge made it clear that Wayfair's actions after the filing of the lawsuit are seen as part of their defense and not part of a concerted effort to defame her. This ruling fundamentally shifts the nature of the litigation. Instead of focusing on the broader scope of Wayfair's activities, the case now becomes more about the core allegations initially made by Blake. These boundaries have made it harder for her to push for documents that could reflect badly on the company or its personnel. This also means that any additional evidence or documents she sought regarding Wayfair's actions after her lawsuit won't carry the same weight they might have before the ruling. While this may seem like a minor procedural matter, the impact is profound. It alters the narrative that Blake had been trying to build, the narrative of an ongoing smear campaign that has been actively working against her. By curtailing the scope of discovery, the court is essentially telling Blake that her claims about Wayfair's ongoing defamation are not supported by the evidence presented in the case. Furthermore, the judge's position on the HR complaints aspect of the case was another blow to Blake's case. She had hoped to access any previous complaints filed against Wayfair, believing that they could highlight a broader issue of misconduct within the company that could support her claims of discrimination and harassment. However, the judge ruled that Blake was only entitled to documents concerning sexual harassment or discrimination complaints directly linked to her case. This ruling significantly limited the information Blake could obtain, closing the door on any potential evidence that was unrelated to the specific claims made in her lawsuit. The judge's decision to limit the scope of Blake's discovery requests reflects a larger trend in legal battles: the need for relevance. Courts are often reluctant to allow the discovery of documents that are too far removed from the central issues of a case. In this case, the judge seemed to prioritize relevance over the expansive request Blake made for information, deciding that documents that had no direct connection to her claims would be of little use in supporting her case. This is especially important in a legal context where the volume of evidence can become overwhelming, and courts need to ensure that only pertinent information is considered. This ruling further complicates Blake's ability to prove her case against Wayfair. Another significant part of the ruling came down to the issue of whether or not Wayfair was required to turn over privileged information. This issue often arises in legal disputes, especially when it comes to communications between a company and its attorneys. Blake's team had sought access to Wayfair's legal strategy, particularly the conversations between Wayfair's executives and their lawyers. However, the judge determined that these communications were protected by attorney-client privilege, meaning that they wouldn't be available for Blake's review. This is a standard ruling in cases where one party seeks to access privileged communications, as it is a fundamental aspect of the legal system to protect the confidentiality of conversations between lawyers and their clients. Wayfair's legal team is entitled to defend the company using privileged information without fear of it being used against them in court. From the perspective of Wayfair, this is a crucial win as it prevents Blake from gaining insight into the company's legal strategy. The ruling also emphasized that anything Wayfair said or did in the context of defending themselves against Blake's lawsuit was not a smear campaign. This part of the decision essentially killed any argument that Blake could make regarding the public defense of Wayfair's actions. As the judge pointed out, Wayfair's communications and actions were all part of their defense strategy in the ongoing litigation, not an attempt to intentionally defame Blake. This clarification was vital because it marked the judge's unwillingness to entertain the idea of a continuous smear campaign. For Blake, this ruling must have been a difficult blow, as her legal team had been attempting to paint the case as one of a concerted effort to destroy her reputation. However, the court's position was clear. Wayfair was simply defending itself against her claims, and anything they did in that context was part of the standard legal process. In light of these developments, the case has now become far more focused on the core issues at hand, rather than the broader narrative of an ongoing smear campaign. The judge has drawn a clear line between what is and isn't relevant to the case. Anything that falls outside of the scope of the original allegations and the ongoing litigation will not be entertained. This could have long-lasting implications for Blake's ability to prove her claims against Wayfair. The limits on discovery are particularly significant in cases like this, where the goal is to obtain evidence that can substantiate the accusations made in the lawsuit. By limiting the scope of what can be considered, the court has essentially made it harder for Blake to present a compelling argument. The ruling also raises questions about the future of the case. With the discovery disputes largely settled, what's left to determine is how the case will proceed to trial, and whether or not Blake will be able to convince a jury of her claims. If she cannot produce the evidence needed to substantiate her allegations, the case could ultimately be dismissed. This is the precarious position that Blake now finds herself in. She's still pursuing her claims, but the court has placed significant limitations on what she can present as evidence. The focus now shifts to the remaining aspects of her case, and the pressure is on for her legal team to find compelling evidence that can back up their client's accusations. This is a crucial juncture in the lawsuit, and the coming weeks will likely determine whether or not Blake has the support she needs to continue her fight against Wayfair. The next critical phase of this case revolves around the discovery disputes that have emerged and how they've influenced the trajectory of Blake's lawsuit against Wayfair. The legal strategies that both parties are deploying have come to a head with the discovery motions leading to some significant legal decisions that could affect how the case unfolds. Moving forward, Blake's legal team had initially sought extensive discovery from Wayfair, hoping to unearth documents that would bolster their case and provide evidence of an ongoing smear campaign that Blake alleges was orchestrated by Wayfair and its employees as part of a broader strategy to damage her reputation in the public eye. The key issue at hand was Blake's ability to demonstrate that Wayfair's actions were part of a sustained and coordinated effort to harm her image, and that these actions were not simply part of the company's defense strategy in the legal battle that has now become the focal point of this litigation. However, despite Blake's requests and the motions filed by her legal team, the judge's ruling in this case significantly limited the scope of discovery in several important ways. First and foremost, the judge decided that any materials requested that extended beyond February 18th were irrelevant to the core issues in the case. The judge made it clear that anything after the date Blake amended her complaint was not connected to the original allegations, and as such could not be part of the ongoing discovery process. This ruling was significant because it curtailed Blake's ability to request documents that might have demonstrated continued misconduct by Wayfair or its employees in the months following the filing of the complaint. The court's reasoning was grounded in the idea that Wayfair's actions after the amended complaint were part of their defense and advocacy in the active litigation, rather than part of a smear campaign against Blake. The judge's decision essentially shut down Blake's attempt to expand the case beyond its original scope, ruling that the relevance of any evidence beyond February 18th would diminish as time passed, and that it would be highly unlikely that any additional documents would prove to be relevant to the claims of discrimination or harassment. In the case, the judge also emphasized that the further removed the documents were from the original allegations, the more likely it would be that they were simply part of the company's defense and not part of any ongoing malicious campaign to defame Blake. The ruling here was critical because it reinforced the idea that litigation in itself is not inherently an effort to destroy someone's reputation, and that in the context of defending themselves, Wayfair had the right to communicate about the case and its allegations, without it automatically being construed as a defamation attempt against Blake. In other words, the judge was signaling that while the case was still ongoing, Wayfair was entitled to defend its position without fear of its actions being construed as harmful to Blake's public image. The ruling on this matter was a significant setback for Blake, who had hoped to present a broader narrative of continuous harm and defamation as part of her legal argument. Blake's team had hoped to establish a pattern of behavior that showed Wayfair had been actively working against her in the public eye, even after she filed her complaint. But the court's decision made it clear that the company's actions from that point forward would only be seen as part of their defense strategy, not as an ongoing conspiracy to undermine her. The court also ruled on another key issue related to the scope of the documents that Blake had requested, namely the question of whether she was entitled to access any other complaints made against Wayfair that could have helped demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The judge ruled that Blake was only entitled to request documents related to complaints of sexual harassment or discrimination that were directly related to her claims, and that any other complaints unrelated to the specific allegations in her case would not be provided to her. This ruling was significant because Blake had hoped to obtain a broader array of documents that could have potentially shown a larger issue within Wayfair with regards to its treatment of employees. But the judge limited her ability to pursue that line of inquiry. The decision narrowed the scope of discovery further and limited Blake's access to any complaints or documents that did not directly pertain to her case. It also added a layer of complexity to Blake's efforts to prove that she was the target of an intentional campaign to harm her reputation and undermine her career by ruling that only certain types of documents would be admissible, and only if they were directly tied to her claims. The judge effectively boxed Blake into a narrower argument and severely limited the evidence she could use to support her case. In the same vein, the court also ruled on the issue of privileged information. Blake's legal team had sought access to communications between Wayfair's legal team and company executives and other privileged documents that could have shed light on the company's strategy in dealing with the lawsuit. However, the court sided with Wayfair on this matter and ruled that the company's communications with its lawyers were protected by attorney-client privilege and therefore could not be disclosed to Blake's legal team. This decision was significant because it kept a key piece of Wayfair's legal strategy hidden from Blake's team, preventing them from having insight into the company's defense tactics. and weakening Blake's position in the case. In addition, the court also made it clear that any statements made by Wayfair or its representatives about Blake following the filing of the lawsuit would be viewed through the lens of active litigation rather than as part of a smear campaign. The judge stressed that in a case like this, where the parties are engaged in ongoing legal proceedings, any public statements made by Wayfair were simply part of their legal defense and could not automatically be interpreted as malicious or defamatory. The judge's ruling reinforced the notion that in a legal context, public statements made in the course of defending a case are generally protected from being construed as libel or slander and are not necessarily a part of an intentional effort to damage the reputation of the other party. This part of the ruling was crucial for Wayfair because it effectively inoculated the company against further claims of defamation by Blake's team and removed a key element of her argument about the case being part of a concerted effort to destroy her reputation. The ruling put an end to the idea that Wayfair's legal strategy could be construed as a smear campaign and closed the door on Blake's ability to use any statements made by Wayfair after the lawsuit was filed as evidence of such a campaign. This decision marked a significant turning point in the litigation as it removed a central argument from Blake's case and left her legal team with fewer avenues to pursue in terms of evidence and strategy. The judge's ruling also established a firm cutoff date for any additional discovery requests related to the case and outlined a clear timeline for the production of documents by Wayfair, which has now limited Blake's ability to argue that there is an ongoing and malicious effort to harm her public image. The legal landscape has shifted dramatically in Blake's favor, and the ruling has raised questions about her ability to continue pursuing the case effectively without the necessary evidence to back up her claims. The decision essentially forces Blake to reframe her argument around the core allegations made in the original complaint and makes it much harder for her legal team to present a convincing case to the court going forward. The ruling is likely to have a significant impact on the remaining stages of the lawsuit as it limits the scope of the discovery process and the type of evidence that can be presented in court. In conclusion, the court's rulings in the ongoing case between Blake Lively and Wayfair have substantially shaped the direction of the lawsuit, marking significant setbacks for Blake's legal team. The judge's decision to limit the scope of discovery, particularly by setting a firm cutoff date of February 18, 2024, effectively curtails Blake's ability to obtain documents and evidence related to any actions by Wayfair beyond that date. This ruling reinforces the principle that active litigation and the defense strategies of a company cannot automatically be construed as part of a smear campaign, thereby significantly weakening Blake's claims. Furthermore, the judge's refusal to grant Blake access to documents related to complaints of discrimination unrelated to her case, as well as communications protected by attorney-client privilege, places additional constraints on her ability to build a compelling argument. By narrowing the scope of evidence and framing Wayfair's public statements as part of their legal defense, the ruling strengthens the company's position, undermining Blake's narrative of continuous harm and defamation.